Welcome to the panel on developing and operationalizing policy. In the last day and a half, we've heard from a number of companies who prioritize trust and safety as part of their brand strategy, and perhaps more importantly, as part of their operations. For this session, we've assembled an expert panel of people who can share their experiences from the inside when it comes to developing and operationalizing those policies. Clearly, it doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work on the part of many dedicated individuals working internally across departments and often with the help of outside experts. So before we get started, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm Pat Vance. I'm president of the Entertainment Software Rating Board. You may know us for the ratings that we're assigning to video games to make sure that consumers are informed prior to purchase, but we also enforce marketing guidelines for the video game industry. And we have a privacy certification program that is FTC approved under COPPA that certifies websites and mobile apps for a number of companies who opt into the program. As far as my background goes, I spent, prior to the ESRB, I spent almost 20 years at ABC and Disney, developing a lot of new markets. I ran the internet group and launched a number of websites, including abc.com, oscar.com, oprah.com, et cetera, at ABC, and also oversaw abcnews.com. And also prior to that, we launched 2 joint ventures in video games on behalf of the company. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Rebecca, would you like to introduce yourself first?
I'm Rebecca Newton. I'm the head of digital trust and community at Super Awesome, which is now an Epic Games company. And I began my career in 1983 in survey research and computer application and design, and worked for government projects, and then joined the commercial internet in 1994 at AOL. I was the program manager for the Community Leader program and wore many other hats during it was about 7 years at AOL. In the 2000s, I was the global director for safety and community, where I was responsible for community safety, public policy, and customer service for Havo's 24 countries, and had a big induction into lots of things, being responsible for 24 different countries. And then I served as the Chief Community and Safety Officer at Mind Candy for 8.5 years and managed Moshi Monster's 104 million young users, mostly in English-speaking countries. And then in 2015, Super Awesome acquired Pop Jam, and they took me and my team, and so I've been there ever since. And about a year ago, Epic acquired us, and now I still serve on many boards. I was on FOSI, as Pat has been for many, many years. I was there for about 3 years. And then I've been on the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, and various other boards in the UK mostly. And I'm still on the advisory board at Privacy Check and a trustee at ditchthelabel.org. That's my background. Thanks.
Fantastic. A real veteran in this space. So thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. Daryl, turning it over to you.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Daryl Stando. I'm the Senior Trust and Safety Policy Manager at Tinder. I actually started my career in Washington, D.C. as a federal policy lobbyist, so came from a very different side of things. And as life changed, moved into law and compliance, and then found my way over to Upwork Trust and Safety team, where I worked in operations, and then moved to build out their policy program. And then almost a year ago now, joined Tinder as the first policy manager and working on building out the program and team here at Tinder.
Fantastic. Ray.
Hey everyone, I'm Ray. I serve as the head of trust and safety at IRL. IRL is a social messenger. We're focused on group chats, helping people organize real and virtual events, and then also discovering communities that they're interested in. I've been with IRL for about 8 months now. Prior to this, I was at PixArt, which is a photo and video editing platform where I led the trust and safety team. Before that, I was one of the founding members of the TikTok trust and safety team. So I work on everything from policy to product strategy to process, and as well as external engagements. Prior to that, I was at Twitter, where I led 2 teams, one that was focused on safety moderation, and then a second that was focused on investigations and intelligence, so looking at how real-world events show up on the platform. And then before that, I spent some time at Uber and Google, mostly in roles around risk and threat analysis to the company and the company's reputation. Super excited to be here and have this conversation.
So glad that you're here. So let's get started. And let's start at the beginning. So where does one start when developing a trust and safety policy for a platform? Is there a framework in which we can start the work? And maybe Ray, you wanna kick it off, and then we'll hand it off to Rebecca and Daryl to add flavor.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a great question. Historically, when the trust and safety industry started many, many years ago, policies were very much rooted in law. So it was very much, what does the law say and how does this apply to our platform? I think more recently, this has evolved and platforms have to make decisions around things that maybe aren't 100% illegal, but are not allowed to be on the platform, or users might not find them savory, or even brand partners, advertisers might not find them savory. When I think about a framework that I've used at previous companies, it's the 3 Ps. So the first would be principles. And this is very much at the organization or the company level. So really, what does the company stand for? An example of this could be something like, we stand for expression, and we want to allow people to show their creativity. Then the next rung down are policies. So these are the kind of guidelines or the rules that govern what's allowed, what's not allowed on the platform. So these get a little bit more specific than principles. So an example policy that aligns to that principle that I mentioned would be something like, we don't allow hate speech. But then when you think about that statement, we don't allow hate speech, it's a little broad, right? So that's where the next rung comes in, which is the playbooks, or some call them enforcement guidelines. And this is, how do you enforce, or how do you make the policies operational? So an example would be, for that policy of we don't allow hate speech, the playbook would be, well, what does hate speech mean? And one thing to think about is that within different markets, within different countries, this might mean different things. So in India, for example, it might include caste, whereas in other markets, it might not. So the playbooks really get to the nitty gritty of how do you operationalize this, but then how do you pass it off onto moderators to also help operationalize this? So that's the framework that I've used at several companies, which has proven to be pretty useful in kind of going from the macro principles to policies to playbooks.
That's incredibly helpful, and a great simplified way to approach the huge task. So Daryl, talk to us a little bit about your experience at Tinder in establishing a framework.
Yeah, so as Ray mentioned, there's kind of this structure, principles, policies, we call them agent guidelines. And really, when we start looking at individual policies, what policies should we have, what shouldn't we have? I'd like to start to think about, like, what problem are we trying to solve? What's the behavior that is happening? And maybe this is theoretical about behavior we don't like or behavior we're concerned about, or maybe this is in response to identified behaviors on the platform and trying to understand what are the impacts of that behavior. And so from there, kind of trying to craft that rule statement around what is the do or don't, kind of based on understanding of the behavior, which is definitely a first challenge to do. And then moving into those agent guidelines, that's really where the rubber meets the road, and trying to make sure that your enforcement population, whether it be agents, moderators, AI, whatever it be, is set up in a way that can get to the goal of whatever that policy was. And so that takes a lot of thought, as well as a lot of trial and error sometimes, in trying to understand what do they understand the policy to be, and how can we make sure that it's written in a way that's digestible and understandable, largely especially for agent populations, to be able to say, oh, okay, I see that behavior and I see what that is, and then that is incorrect or not. And so that's definitely a big challenge, but a big part of the ongoing policy process, and making sure that the end of the day, the decisions being rendered are the decisions we intended by that policy.
Yeah, that's really helpful as well. So Rebecca, it's different for when you're dealing with a product that's directed to under 13. So maybe let's talk a little bit about what do you do if you've got a child-directed product, and how do you approach trust and safety?
Sure. Yeah, our approach is a little different. I mean, some things are the same for everybody because we're all human, but we have to think about not only the software, and we have to do quite a bit of tweaking. We've spent about 8 years working with our software company, just getting it just right for what our needs are. But there's also the parent versus the teacher versus caretaker roles. So the moderators are not law enforcement, and they're not teachers, and they're not parents. We have to find those fine lines, especially with kids, where you want to the propensity is to get a little parental, but it's not really our role. So and we have to meet, as you know, regulatory guidelines, and we have lots of legal considerations for everything that we build, and all our policy, et cetera. And then there's how far do we go? When do we not be parents? And what is it? What if a parent says it's okay to do X, Y, Z, but we don't agree with that, or vice versa? So there's a lot that goes into it, and besides the legal team, the product designers and developers, and then our team, the community moderation team, we have to really think hard about how to find those fine lines, because nothing fits in a box, which is true really for any age group, but we don't have as much leeway. And then we have to think about the intention of the child or the person that was posting. Kids often repeat things they hear, and so are we going to be so hard-lined as, oh, you did this, so you're out? And so we have to think about what was their intention. So that's our moderation model. It's called intentional moderation. Is what is the intention of the person who posted, and how will this affect the community as a whole? So I could talk for 3 hours just about this, but
Yeah.
hopefully that
And
helps.
of course, it's understanding a child's intent is
Yeah. It's a whole thing. But I've got a team I've had for some of them for 20 years. So it's really, that makes a huge difference. It's like second nature to most of the people on the team. And everybody on the team has been with me, except for a few people, for at least 5 to 10 years. So it makes a big difference to have sort of grown up with the internet with the kids, because now we have kids who are children of people who were children online, right? So that's a good thing, actually, because now the parents are much more attuned to how it all works. So
yeah, very interesting. So as you create these policies and playbooks, how do you get buy-in across the organization, especially when certain policies may impact user engagement or revenue models, and is there such a thing as an ROI when it comes to implementing a trust and safety plan?
At a macro level, usually I like to start with, it's the right thing to do, right? I think as a company, understanding that, yes, there are many push and pull factors externally that may lead us to have stricter policies or in certain markets, but at our core as a company, we need to all believe that this is the right thing to do, right? So regardless of what team you're on, trust and safety, or keeping users safe is not just the job of one department or organization. I think that when you get into kind of, how do you work with other teams? How do you operationalize this, for lack of a better phrase? I like to try to get as upstream as possible in the product development or the marketing strategy or the growth strategy process. I think a lot of times what I've seen is there's a little bit of reticence toward, well, what is the impact that this is going to have on our growth or our user base or our retention if trust and safety isn't involved early on. So if we're involved early on, we can start having those discussions about, if we do it this way, we're likely to see this sort of downstream impact. So folks aren't as surprised once the feature launches or once the campaign launches as to why the numbers may be different. So it's a little bit of level setting. I think that I also, will have very frank conversations internally. Back to the point around, it's the right thing to do. I would say over the last couple of years, there's been a little bit more of an expectation from the public and also from users to have a safe environment, to have a positive environment, to have an inclusive environment. And then I'll try to tie, and this is a little bit more difficult, and oftentimes it takes a little bit of like data finagling and working with data scientists, but can you tie specific instances of objectionable content being on the platform to users churning or to retention decreasing, right? So I think if you can find those ways to show that, hey, creating a positive environment, an inclusive environment, and a safe environment actually leads users to stick around longer, refer more people, be more engaged, exhibit good behavior. So I think having those conversations, and this is, I would say, is a newer space that's emerging, is how do we measure the impact and the ROI of trust and safety? So like on that note, I'm actually really curious to hear what Daryl and Rebecca have to share on this, because we're still learning where I'm at.
So our biggest challenge is friction, right? Because we have under 13s. They want to, they don't want to have to go through a whole process just to get an account, and they have to go through a whole process with COPPA and GDPR and various other, now states within the United States have different regulations and that sort of thing. So that's always the pain point, is that the company marketing and sales and product and stuff, they want to get everybody in there, and that it's not that they don't have regard for the regulations. That's never been a problem any place I've worked, except for maybe once, but that was a long time ago. But no, so everybody's hyper aware of that and respectful, but it's like, how can we do this when we can't even get parents to sign permission slips for schools, right? So, how are you going to get them to buy into, okay, now you got to come and you've got to fill out this and you've got to answer that and we've got to meet you and that sort of thing. So that's a big issue for us. So then we have to either redesign or design the product so there's no information, personally identifying information, PII, flowing. And that can be anything. That's a big continuum, anything between a school uniform that we have to train our people to look for, or is there anything in the background that has a city or a bus or a driver's license, or not a license plate, or we have to train everybody for that, up to somebody telling somebody, I'm from New Jersey and my name is Joe Smith, and I'm 7 years old, or whatever. So there's a lot for us to think about with that, and it isn't the most popular subject in the company, but and really with it's hard because in our culture now it's ubiquitous that everybody's telling everything about their lives online. Some people are recording their lives online, right? So the kids are seeing this, but then it's like, do as I say, not as I do. And so that's what we're facing every day. The return on investment piece, I'd say, well, we can measure because we're particularly in safe advertising to kids. So we have partnerships, and I know we're going to get to that in a minute, so I won't go into that too much now. But so we can directly measure that here we have this team, and this is what they do. So the partners and the people that we're working with don't have to worry about regulatory issues, about upset parents, about privacy issues, data protection, all of that. So that's something that I feel like we can measure pretty well. So I hope that wasn't too.
Of course, you can also talk about potential enforcement actions from regulators for not complying, whether it's with COPPA or the Age Appropriate Design Code or numerous other safety.
Yes, that's a good point.
Regulations as well, but yeah, I mean, certainly in the children's space, you have to be so careful.
Yes.
Daryl, you want to talk about what you do to try to get buy-in across the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ray, I'm with you on the ROI question. If you figure that out, give me a call. Let me know. Definitely, there are things we can look at. I think, user impact, the user experience is something that's really critical. In terms of getting buy-in across an organization, it does really depend on the organization and the levels of support for trust and safety just generally, and the understanding of its importance. a couple of kind of practical things that I've tried to do where I'm at is, two things. One, be informed, right? Know your space, know what you're talking about, have critical examples on hand to be able to provide to people. Sometimes it can be really difficult to explain to somebody, why hate speech is bad. Or what hate speech is, as an example. These sometimes can be really difficult conversations. And so having actual examples of what this looks like on your platform is really helpful for folks to go, oh, that's what's happening. And to the extent that we have brought in teams to actually look and view our cases, actually creates this awareness of like, oh, that's what we're talking about. This is why it's important. And I think that's really critical. The other thing is kind of going back to my starting days as a lobbyist is kind of a little bit of hitting the pavement and just being out there and with these other teams. It's, a lot of times trust and safety has been very siloed. It's been kind of put on, it's in its little corner and it functions over there. And to the extent that you can work and building just general relationships with people across your company in different departments, whether that's marketing and comms or product or engineering, or even sometimes HR or other folks to help them be aware that this exists and why it exists. I found that can be really helpful in getting you brought into those conversations earlier, because they just even know, oh, this person might have something to say here. This person might have some impact. So we kind of have to be our own, bit of our own, tout our own horn and go out there and let people know that we exist, but it can be really helpful.
Oh, I just have something to say about that very thing. That's really a great point, Daryl. One of the things that can happen with people in the trust and safety business or industry is that we become the people that nobody wants to talk. Let's not involve them. Oh my God, they say no to everything, right? So being the person that says, I'm not here to say no, I'm here to say, how can we do this? And that is something I luckily learned early on at AOL, because people would just be like, ugh, don't call them, So I know that it's really important for us to be very open-minded and find solutions rather than all the reasons you can't do this. How about ways that we can do this? Or let's put our heads together and figure out how we can do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
If I can just add one other thing as well, is because I know there's some brand safety and marketers listening in, but at one company that I worked at in the past, there were questions from partners, from ad agencies, from marketers on, why should we work with your platform? How safe is your platform? Are ads going to appear next to objectionable content? And those questions came to the sales team, and the sales team came to trust and safety and said, can you help explain how we do moderation? Can you help explain our policies? Can you help explain our stance on objectionable content, right? So I think finding ways to make that impact and make some other team's job easier. And I think what I saw at the company that I'm talking about is that there was a direct connection between us opening the doors a little bit on trust and safety, being very transparent about it with some of these ad partners, and them being willing to spend. So we could tie back and say, trust and safety was able to help unlock X dollar spend as a result of talking about our moderation policies or our moderation practices, and then just allowing those partners to feel a little bit more comfortable working with the company.
Great point, Ray. And it's a good segue into my next question for all of you, which is, there's always this tension between moderation and free speech. I mean, you want to have a platform or a product that enables people to share and see what other people are sharing. But that it's always a tension. How do you strike the right balance?
I've worked with companies as they're very small or just starting out trust and safety. So what has been really helpful is who's our user base and how is the product being used has been a really good starting point for how much moderation do we need to have, right? I think it's really, and I'm really curious to hear how Rebecca approaches this, because I think, for a lot of companies that are newer start out with users that are teenagers, right? Maybe between 13 and 16, and your policies might need to be slightly different for if your user base is 90% 13 to 16-year-olds, right? You might have a little bit more of a stricter stance on sexualized content or what it means to talk about certain things, right? So I think understanding your user base is a really good place to start with this discussion of, content moderation versus free speech, although I don't like to look at them as, one or the other. I think it's kind of a balance between. But that's always been really helpful, is starting to understand the user and not being afraid, and that your policies may need to change over time, right? As more users come on, as your users age up, as you get different types of content, you might need to make a policy that was once very strict because of the community that you had on your platform, maybe a little bit less strict. And I think this is something that a lot of platforms have struggled with, is as the internet has exploded and we see users coming online younger and younger, their willingness to talk about subjects that maybe we didn't talk about when I was a teenager has changed, right? So platforms are now starting to grapple with, do we show something to a user or allow them access to something that maybe we didn't have access to or we weren't talking about when we were that age? So it's really this fine balance. And I think it really just goes back to what your platform wants to be. I've had folks on my team before that say, well, this platform does it this way, so I think we should do it this way. And oftentimes we have that discussion about, yes, this platform does it that way and they're a big platform, but we are a very different platform and we're serving a different user. So I think really understanding that and not just going with what is mainstream or what other platforms are doing, although it's really useful to have their lead and understand it, not just taking that as de facto.
Yeah, definitely. Rebecca, since Ray asked you to comment, you want to talk about
Yeah,
how you approach this? It's
free
tough.
speech and kids. Yeah, I really like how you just framed all of this, Ray. It's really good. Yeah, so we have a really tough situation. I mean, there's in some ways it's easier because we just block a lot of content, right, that is not okay because they're all young and they're under 13. But we have conversations internally with lots of different people about what's okay and what's not okay. So when the Black Lives Matter situation came up, there were lots of posts about that. And then there were, of course, posts about no, all lives matter, no blue lives matter, no rainbow lives matter, this and that. And so our approach, I really like what you said. You don't do what does Disney do, or what is, whoever our contemporaries are. It is important to know that for contrast and for reference. But we come to policies about free speech and kids based on what we think is appropriate or inappropriate. So we don't allow violence, any discussion about guns, sweet foods. There's a whole thing, right, about too much sugar in foods and stuff, that sort of thing. We have some internal policies about what advertising will allow, so we follow that. And then with our partners, we work with them. We have to train them about what's okay and what's not okay. How much skin can somebody show? And kids, what can they what can they discuss and talk about? The LGBTQI conversations that come up are always a thing. And then religion, right? So our policy, sort of just a blanket policy, is anything that excludes another human being is not allowed. So that can be pretty big. That can be the we only wear plaid club. I just made that up. There is no such club that I know of. But if kids do that just to keep other kids out, or I'm a Christian, you can't come in here unless you're saved, or whatever. They tend to, kids want to do those kind of things because they're discovering themselves. So we have to find that line that's, where are they just sort of experimenting and where are they being exclusive? And and we tell them this is excluding people and that's not what we're about. And we also don't allow discussion about self-harm or my mother has cancer and is dying, and we just don't allow it because it's not what we're about. We're not a social work platform for kids. There's lots of places for kids to go get that kind of help. We are a place for people to create and have fun and share art and share things that they think are beautiful and fun and positive. And so that's how we've come about with our policies. It's kind of it maybe seems arbitrary. It's not, but it's our, it's arbitrary maybe to the world, but and we get parents who say that why can't my kid make a club for Christians only? And it's like, they can't make a club for people with pink shoes only. It's not about being a Christian. So, or whatever it is, plaid shirts, etc. So I think that's how I like that idea of everybody coming together. Like, what do we believe in? And let's just stick with that. And let's be transparent or honest with the kids and parents about what it is that we allow, and that there are plenty of other places to do that. Talk about people who cut or whatever, but it's not what we do. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah. And so hard. So Daryl, do you want to add anything?
Just maybe as a summary point to what's already been said is like, this is where those policy principles that Ray mentioned earlier as your starting point are so critical, because by establishing those, you're going to establish, in the sense of policy, you're really looking at who are we as a company, who are we as a brand, and what role do you want to play in the lives of your members? And when you've established that in your principles, it really does trickle down and help you make those hard decisions, which this is definitely one of those areas that can be very difficult to have those discussions about. But going back to who you are and what you're trying to achieve really can help guide that discussion for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're going to go back to that a lot. So to make your lives even more complicated, clearly there are differences in regional and cultural norms, and what's appropriate in terms of safety in one region may not be the same in another. So how does one go about, addressing those differences when, you've got a global product, but yet you're trying to create a policy and a framework that works across the globe?
So I'm happy to jump in.
Daryl, take it away.
So I think there is definitely a frontline question that every company needs to ask themselves if they're global, and that's, are we offering globalized policies that are applicable across the globe, or are we offering localized policies? And again, that goes back to who you are as a company and what you're trying to achieve. And also your resourcing. Localized policies is a huge resource investment, but that can be something that's very part of who you are as a company, and you want to support that. So I think those are really big questions that have to be answered. In terms of if, thinking about just generally, how are we building policies that have kind of global impact, and how are we even I think the first starting point is making sure you have a lot of viewpoints in the room when you are developing those policies, making sure that the discussion includes people from different cultures, from different experiences, from different perspectives. That's how we get really good policy, but that will also help bring in some of those other considerations that an individual won't be able to provide because they've never lived in that environment. They've never had that experience. And so to the extent you can, without slowing down your process too much, bringing in those outside experiences, it can be really, really helpful in that process.
Daryl covered a lot of what I was going to mention. I'll posit two things that are always top of mind for me when thinking about global versus regional. The first is, should the policies be different about where the content is viewable versus where the content is posted? And sometimes there's like legal or regulatory requirements or outlines that can help answer those questions, but other times it's not. And then the next piece that we'll then go to when we have that discussion is, is there a fix that we can do from a product standpoint to maybe geofence, which is the idea that maybe content is only viewable in certain geographies or cannot be viewable in certain geographies, right? So I think this is both, in my view, a policy question as well as like a product question. And a lot of what we've talked about today, I think there is this interplay between policy and what you stand for as a company and what you allow. And there are product ways in which you can, you can help achieve these goals. So that's one thing that I wanted to ensure that I highlighted, because oftentimes it's easy to write a policy and enforce it, but then the product doesn't really talk to it in the same way that you want it to. So I think when you write policies, it's really important to ensure that it kind of flows within your product and makes sense within your product. Going back to the conversation we had around younger users or free speech versus content moderation, the product kind of corollary here is that you build tools to give users or their parents the ability to dial down a slider and say, I don't want them to see anything with a swear word, right? And as they grow up, maybe they up that. So I think there's this interesting interplay between your policies and how you enforce it, but then how you make it kind of live within your product and give users that a little bit of an agency there.
Yeah, and one size doesn't always fit all, both from your user standpoint, but certainly on a global basis, it doesn't either. And you brought up regulations, which I think are going to become more and more complicated over time, not easier.
There's a major fast food chain in the world that the Northern Europeans were horrified when we were at Havo that we did a deal with in the US and Canada in North America, and said, oh my God. So there was all this conversation about whether that was okay, because it wasn't okay in any of the Northern European countries. So those are the kind of things. It's almost always food related with kids anyway, and it's okay. I mean, I respect it, but you also, like in America, everything's commercial. The whole country is commercial, so it's very different than the rest of the world in my experience. Although the UK is sort of starting to get more commercial, but over the years, but they also have some very strict food laws for kids. So we do have to look, the advertisers, the advertising partners and account managers have to look into, keep up with all of that. We have whole Slack groups that are just like where people ask those questions. I'm in Australia and we want to do this. Is that okay? So, and so, but we're lucky within the app and the platform, and that we just we let legal decide all that, and then we dial up and dial down. And I like what Ray said about, a slider. We actually have a virtual slider in our software that does that very thing for everything, for sexuality, swearing, etc. And we never turn it up, but we could if we started working with 16-year-olds tomorrow or something. So I think that's very important, and something that's going to have to happen with future software, AI software.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think we have time probably for one more question. So I'm going to just throw this out. It's a little bit of a different type of question, but there's been a lot of talk about safety by design, or privacy by design, of course. Before that, what are the best tactics to incentivize or reward user compliance with trust and safety policies? I think this is a developing art, or call it a science, but I know a lot of companies are trying to build it into the product to reward users or incentivize users that are supportive and compliant with the policies that all of you are developing.
I think this is a great place that we're exploring, right? There's a lot of options. There's a lot of different types of things that we could be doing, and that really, we kind of have to test out, right, with our individual environments and see what most makes sense. I think a foundational thing, though, that's really important that we're starting to see more of is just user education. I remember very vividly a conversation with a leader in trust and safety saying, well, of course they know about it. It's in the terms of service. And I had to be like, that's actually not how that works. So unfortunately, right, we have so many users who are good intentioned. They just have no idea that there are even rules that they need to be thoughtful about. And so that is definitely like a really good starting point as you think about rewarding. It's like, how do we just make sure that they're on the same page as us to start with, in a way that we don't even have to get to an enforcement standpoint. And that these users can also be our partners when we think about reporting bad behavior. If they already are aware of these rules and understanding that there are rules and there's systems in place that will allow them to help protect their own community, that we can get them on the same page and to help us with that process. So I think education is really a big first step.
Yeah, huge plus one to the education component. I like to think that most users don't want to be bad or be problematic. The other thing too, all of us today, we agreed basically that every platform should have its own rules. And as a user, if I go to one platform versus the next, I might not know the ins and outs of the enforcement guidelines. So I might say something that might be okay on one and not okay on the other. So it's imperative for us to teach them. I think when I think about two other ways that we could incentivize this, or I've seen platforms or some companies do this, One is through gamification, right? So usually it plays up or shows up in the form of badges, right? So can you put something on the profile that the user has, I don't know, done something specific. At my last company at Pixart, we actually, for National Anti-Bullying Month, we had a pledge that users could sign. And once they signed the pledge, they got access to a special sticker pack, right? So there was a little bit of an incentive to, hey, read this pledge, follow the pledge, but here's also like a little bit of a token or a badge or something that you can do. And then I think the third, and this is a space that's newer, but I'm excited to see how this develops over time, is for those users that are good, as your product develops, can you offer them early access to features? So I think, Facebook has done a little bit of this and it's been public, which is, you're not allowed to access the live streaming feature if you've had several community guidelines violations in the past, right? So I think it's the same concept of if a user has demonstrated they're good, maybe they're able to unlock features that may be a little bit more high risk. So you incentivize them basically to be good, to unlock these features later on or other features they want to use.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a couple of things. We developed something that we call a user trust system many years ago in 2014 with our third-party vendor, software vendor, and excuse me, and we had to we tried it out, and now we've been using it for many years and tweaking it. And what that does is it allows, so everybody's moderated. Oh, I hope no kids are watching this because now they're going to know our secret. But everybody in our apps, they're all every piece of content, the first 5 to 10 pieces of content we look at, no matter who they are, everybody that's new. One of the things I've found in the almost 30 years I've been doing this is that when kids misbehave, they do it right away. They don't spend 3 months building a reputation or 3 weeks or whatever in their platform and then just blow it in one fell swoop. So we know that when that happens, either somebody's got their account and it's usually a brother or a best friend, or something weird has happened right at home. So we look at everybody's everything when they first join. And then as they post, we assess and say, oh, you know what? They've done X amount of posts, so we're going to look at certain percentage. Everything else goes through a filter, so it's not like it's just for free for all. But they don't have to wait 3 minutes, 2 minutes, or whatever, because everything happens quicker for them. So they learn that. And then we also reward with badges and things. And we have something called a neon star, which everybody aspires to be, right? And so they have to work their way up to being a neon star. At Habbo, that was a real problem because they were teenagers. And boy, did we see behavior issues all over the world. But interestingly, in some countries, no behavior issues. And then in some countries, big time. So I learned a lot about the culture and kids in each country. But you have to be careful not to be a goody two-shoes. You don't want to give them a goody two-shoes badge because then everybody's like, yeah, apple for the teacher, right?
That's not cool.
Yeah, it's not cool at all. So I made something up called the Habbo X's when we were their experts, short for experts, and they had a big X. And it didn't mean that you were super well behaved and polite, although we hope for that, but it meant that you really knew a lot about Habbo and that country's Habbo, and so they'd see the X and they could ask you, how do I do this? How do I do that? So ambassador type programs are always really helpful. So I could do a whole 3 hours on that too, but I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, no, there is so much here. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but I want to thank the whole panel. This has been an incredible conversation. I could, discuss this topic with you for, days on end. So with that, just again, sincere thanks for everybody for participating, and hopefully you out there watching the session got something out of it. So thank you.